Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. I'm really excited. We have an awesome group of panelists with us today to share more about their hearts and their work in engineering as well as serving globally. My name is Abby Greason and I'm a coach with GoCore. I've been working with GoCore for about 4 years now. And I'm actually calling from Texas today, and we'll have our panelists telling you where they're calling from. We're calling from all over. And something that I've loved as a coach with GoCore the last few years is the way that the Lord has connected our goers' skills and passions and hobbies and their degree with the work that he's doing all across the nations. And engineering has been something that's been really cool just to see the Lord use that field and that profession to bring glory to his name and to bring very tangible and realistic and wholeness to communities and people. And so I'm excited today to really highlight that, how engineering looks serving globally. So I brought some professionals in to help me today. We have some panelists that are going to share more about themselves. And yeah, so Scott, would you start us off? Just tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Abby. My name is Scott. I'm calling in today from Austin, Texas. I went to the University of Texas at Austin. That's where I graduated from. I have a BS in civil engineering. And now I work at a large commercial civil engineering firm here in Austin. I'm a PE and a team lead at the firm. And just, a little bit about my background connection to GoCore. So I served with GoCore 2012, 2013 in the Middle East with a business startup that was, part ministry, part obviously trying to utilize my skills, training, and engineering to serve the business.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. We love getting to see alum goer join us. So Matt, would you share more about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Matt, obviously, and I'm calling from Washington State, just a couple days from heading back to Papua, Indonesia, where I live and serve most of the time. I went to Seattle Pacific University for undergrad, and then Columbia University in New York for graduate school, studying engineering and mission as an undergrad, and then earth and environmental engineering in graduate school. Right now, I direct a language school in Papua, Indonesia, and I'm excited to be newly connected to GoCore as I look at especially recruiting teachers to come out to Papua, Indonesia.
Yeah, Matt, we're excited for you too. And I'm glad we caught you before you were going back. I didn't know. So I'm glad that we set this up when we did. Aaron, would you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, my name's Aaron. I'm calling in from Newberg, Oregon today. I went to George Fox University in Newberg, where I'm living currently, and I studied mechanical engineering and graduated almost 3 years ago now. So currently, I've gone through the GoCore process and I'm waiting to depart.
Yeah, Aaron, it's so weird to see you on this side of it as your coach through the process, but really exciting to kind of pick your brain today as well. I feel like the roles are reversed today and I get to learn from you. So yeah, that is what today's virtual event, this webinar is all about, is asking the experts. How do you use your engineering degree in a cross-cultural setting? Why use it in a cross-cultural setting? And so we'll go ahead and just dive straight into questions for our panelists and really just pick their brain and hear what they have to say. So Aaron, we'll start with you. As a kind of recent grad, 3 years feels recent to me. Thinking back to being a senior and maybe even before that, what were your options after graduation? What were the things you were looking at going into? And what made you choose this direction? What made you choose, yeah, I'm going to go global?
Yeah, so after graduation and leading up to it, my intent has been to work internationally, and that's part of why I got my engineering degree. Yeah, so as I was graduating, tons of people around me had jobs. I was looking for a job locally, and I didn't have one yet. But I decided that I wanted to work in the US for a couple of years to get work experience, to learn from some really solid engineers, and also to get some savings, and then to go overseas. Right after graduating from college, I actually bought a one-way ticket to Europe. And so I traveled through Europe for 2 months. During that time, I actually interviewed for a job in the US. And so then I came back and worked for a while. And then through the process of working in a number of jobs here, I eventually came to the place where I was like, okay, I think now is the time that I'm ready to pursue something international with my work.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I would say at GoCore, we hear a little bit of that. People are usually across the spectrum. Sometimes they have thought about using their degree globally for years, and that was something they were headed towards, like you. And sometimes it's brand new, and they never thought about using their degree globally until their senior year, and somehow they got connected with GoCore, or they heard about an opportunity to do that. And so that's really cool to hear kind of where you fell with that. So Scott, I think the next question will be for you then. With your experience both on the field and now off the field, but administering engineering, often a concern we hear from students is that they might be wasting their major by choosing to do something like GoCore, something where ministry is really entangled into that. What would you say to that? What would a response to that kind of question or that concern be, engineer to engineer? You've worked so hard for this degree. Is that wasting?
Yeah, no, I get it. As engineers, we want to be efficient, right? Like so much of our job is just centered around this idea of creating something, designing something that's efficient as possible. So the idea of, spending 4 years getting this, difficult, challenging degree, and then to immediately get a job that doesn't use it at all or marginally uses it just feels very wasteful. I even remember back to when I was graduating, feeling kind of that weight and that pressure of like, you can get a really good paying job, you should get a really good paying job. I think it's just kind of this conventional wisdom and just kind of cultural expectation. But what I would say is one, don't assume that there's not an opportunity out there internationally that can use what you've been studying in school for the last 4 years. The reality is I think GoCore has some great placements and is always adding new placements that, really can use your degree in a practical way. That was my experience serving overseas. I found a placement that needed a civil engineer and someone with my background and ended up using that in a direct way. I think the other piece of that is that, if you're looking at a placement that doesn't use engineering at all, don't assume that, that's not going to be something that comes up in your 2 years, that there's not going to be an opportunity that comes up. So my wife actually served overseas with GoCore as well in South Asia, and, her degree was in math. So similar story, she was doing Bible translation in South Asia with a math degree, and she's like, this has nothing to do with it. But she actually ended up teaching at an orphanage, teaching math to some of the children in the orphanage. And so it wasn't something she planned on or something she knew going into it, but it was an opportunity where her degree opened doors for ministry once she got to the field and kind of found out what the opportunities were.
I love something you said at the end, that her degree or even your degree opens the door for opportunities. And I think that's something that GoCore has really seen in the last 11 years of being an organization is college students work really hard to graduate. A lot of time and money and effort and tears are spent getting there. Graduation day is a big deal. But this idea that you said of, man, yeah, all those things you worked hard towards, they open up more opportunities, more and more and more. And you do see that. And I think we've heard so many success stories, if you will, of how students were able to use their degree in different facets to both meet real needs, like you were saying, to really come alongside and be the engineer or be that teacher, and then also really get to dive deep into what does it look like to disciple and to bring the gospel to places where the gospel is needed. So I love the idea that you shared, Scott. I think that's really, really interesting, and one of the core values that I would say GoCore really tries to cling to is that idea. Matt, the next question will be for you. So I know that you said you're kind of new to the whole GoCore thing, but I'd love to hear from you, thinking about what GoCore does, or like what you do, or ways that you're connected even outside of those two worlds. How do you see a program like GoCore being helpful to an engineer's long-term profession? So kind of taking the idea that Scott just shared, this is what I was thinking, and this is how I saw skills used. How does that look maybe long-term? How would something like this in an engineer's profession help or come alongside them?
It's I want to answer that question in two parts. There's I think the long-term, which is really important, but the short-term that builds into that. Starting there, when I was an undergrad, I felt this call to ministry. I was studying engineering. I had no idea how to do ministry and engineering. I didn't know those two things could be related. And through my journey, I found out that, wow, there's a huge need for the problem solving skill set, the training that engineers have to do work abroad as missionaries or in a variety of contexts. And so had I known about GoCore at that time, it would have just really made my life a lot easier and smoother for those first few years. It was only a few months ago that I found out about GoCore, but I see this this way that engineers, especially new college grads, can get quickly connected to opportunities and then be equipped to actually go out and serve in these opportunities, not having to reinvent the wheel, but having a process that's laid out, and these connections is so important, because then once engineers get overseas and have these experiences where they are serving and working abroad, whether they stay, long term, I've been working about a decade overseas now, and I can tell you there's just nothing more satisfying. I worked in the semiconductor industry for a couple of years in the US, and I would never go back. I love the work overseas. But even if after GoCore, once an engineer comes back, that new way of looking at the world, cross-cultural skill set that's developed, it will serve an engineer so well working back in the US someday, if that's the direction they go.
Yeah, often my husband and I joke about that. If we would have known about GoCore after college, we would have been sold on it. Wouldn't have mattered. I think what we took, we would have been just like all in. And so I think that's a really cool thing for you to kind of echo as well. And yeah, I love that idea that you said. It kind of helps you look at things differently, and you really are impacted. And we often tell our goers that those 2 years is going to change and grow a lot in you, and that includes professionally, whether you're an engineer or a teacher or a nurse or whatever you end up using to go. It really does open up your eyes, and you can't not do this and come back unchanged. That is just not something we often see. And so I think that's a really cool idea to kind of bring into the conversation as well, thinking about your profession. All right, so next, Scott, tell me a little bit more about, you kind of mentioned that you did serve with GoCore, your wife served with GoCore. So tell me, what was it like transitioning back into an engineering job here in the United States after serving overseas for 2 years?
Yeah, it was. I'm trying to think back. It's been a little while, but I don't remember it being particularly difficult. My situation was a little bit unique because I had worked in the industry for about a year before I joined GoCore and then served overseas. So I knew a little bit about what commercial engineering was like. I will say it was one of the things that when I first graduated and got a job was kind of the height of the recession back in 2010. And so I just kind of took the only job I could find. After 2 years being in ministry, not in commercial engineering at all, when I got a job, I actually got like a 25% raise on what I was making before for not having worked in the industry for 2 years. And that was just a function that the market was better for engineering jobs at that time than 2 years before when I had first gotten into the industry. So that was something, really neat that for me was just kind of, felt like God's blessing that, the timing was right for me to get back into commercial engineering in that season. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, the theory, the numbers, the work is kind of the same everywhere. So I don't feel like there were really any bumps with the work. The commute changed a little bit. Some of the day-to-day tasks, being in kind of a traditional office setting was definitely a little bit of a change from where I was working in the Middle East. But otherwise, it felt like a really smooth transition, and just really something that the Lord really blessed.
Yeah, I guess a secondary question to that too, Scott, that is asked a lot is, were you able to, like on your resume coming back, talk about the things that you did, whether it was projects or other types of work in interviews and on that resume after serving for 2 years? Did you find that you were able to put some of those things on that resume and then go into interviews and talk about those 2 years? Sometimes students think it's like a blip, it's 2 years and then who knows what's going to happen. You come back and you have nothing to kind of to talk about from those 2 years. So were you able to use those skills, put them on a resume, talk about that when you came back, or what did that look like for you, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one, there were practical skills, things that I did overseas that I could put on the resume that were related to what I'd be doing here in the US. So there was a direct translation there. I worked directly with the national government in the country that I was serving in with some of the tasks that I was working on. So, that always looks really impressive on your resume if you can put, interfaced with the federal government of this country to get something approved. Um, I think, also it just, you're always talking about, and this is something for me now in a position where I review resumes and hire people at my job. You look for something that jumps out at you on a resume. I mean, saying that you lived in the Middle East and worked for a company there is something that definitely jumps out and catches people's attention. So even if it's just, getting your resume higher up the stack because you've got some experience that people want to hear more about, it's one of those things, if I saw that on a resume, I'd at least give someone an interview, when I might not have otherwise, just because they have a really unique experience I want to hear more about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's cool that you're in that job now where you get to see that and kind of speak into. Aaron, I want to ask you kind of a big question that we are asked by people a lot in the process. As a coach, my job is to walk through from beginning to end with each candidate that I work with. So Aaron, I worked with you for a while last year, for quite a few months, gearing up towards what you're doing now. And I think a question that goers often come back to is this idea of, is it strategic? Is it strategic, and does it actually make sense for me to do this? And so I guess the question I'd ask you, Aaron, is how do you see engineering being strategic for the gospel, engineering globally? How do you, as someone that's about to step into that world, that has said yes for 2 years, how do you see that being strategic?
I think one of the ways that it's super strategic, and this was before I even started studying engineering, is that engineers are needed everywhere in the world. So a bit of my background, I grew up in East Africa for 18 years. My parents were missionaries there, and the work they did was awesome. It was amazing. But I always felt this, like, that's not what I want to do. I want to work internationally. I really want to do that. But I also want to be able to go to countries where you can't go as a missionary or as an outspoken Christian. And so I think that's one way that engineering really is strategic for the gospel, is that you can especially get into those closed countries as well, but also that every country in the world needs engineers, and there is no shortage of jobs.
Abby, could I just add to that?
Yeah, please do.
I just think when we think about the gospel holistically, to piggyback and extend off of what Aaron was saying, there's ministering to people's spiritual needs, but physical needs is so huge. And at the core of engineering, whether it's infrastructure or any kind of engineering problem solving, it's helping people often, with physical needs. So at its core, I see engineering as a huge potential, especially internationally, for bringing that, that ministry to the gospel through physical need work.
It's interesting you say that, Matt, because I'll talk about our placements at the end, just kind of highlighting, as an engineer, what are the options through GoCore this year? And as I think about those two that we have that are really engineering heavy, just very specific to engineers, getting that degree and then using that in a very tangible way, I think that they are very much geared towards a holistic need. Like, how do you actually provide sustainable jobs? How do you make this ship go from remote island to remote island without an engineer? It just doesn't happen. I know for myself, engineering doesn't make sense, and I could never do what you guys do. And so I'm so thankful that there are minds like yours that can get, that ship from place to place, that can create and think through, man, how do we dry this fruit that's in abundance in this country to provide jobs for these families so that they're not living on nothing. And so I think that's a really interesting idea, Matt, that the gospel is holistic. And as an engineer, you really tangibly see that. You see how you're meeting those physical needs and then really getting to enter into gospel conversations and gospel interactions. And so, yeah, I love that. I think that's a really, really cool way of kind of wording that. Well, Matt, I have another question for you. kind of thinking a little bit about engineers and what maybe they think through as they are looking at what's after graduation. What would you say to someone that is considering doing engineering internationally? What advice would you give them? Or like if you had a student coming to you and they're throwing out some options, and international and serving globally seems to be one of the three, what would your advice be to an engineer exploring that option?
Yeah, I'd have two responses. And it's funny you asked this because I got to adjunct teach at some schools this fall, and I had some students who came to me with this very question. It's so fun to come alongside students and encourage them. And simply, my first response is lean into it, really push into that. If you feel just the hint of a desire to go and work internationally, to serve internationally, really lean into it. And I think as a student, especially, junior, senior year, studying engineering, there's such a huge course load. It can really be overwhelming to think, how do I carve this path that might not be clear? So I think the second thing I would say to students is the way you lean into it, how you do it, I really think is with GoCore. I think unless you already know there's an organization out there and you already have experience doing fundraising and A, B, and C, if you have that really clear understanding of where and how, perfect. For me, and I think for a lot of folks who find that initial calling, it's overwhelming. And I think, to pursue and to really lean into it, GoCore can clear the path and really make a way, especially for busy engineering students who can't sort through applying to 20 different, places out there or trying to learn how to do fundraising on their own. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I always joke with my students, my job as a coach is to make your job easier. Our process, and the reason you have a coach through GoCore is because we know that as a senior, especially, you're walking through a lot. It's a really hard season where you're juggling so many things, and applying for your future is just one of them. And so, yeah, we love getting to come along students and kind of guide them through that process. And I think that's something that I always echo to candidates I'm working with as well, is this idea of leaning into where you're feeling led and really just kind of testing out the waters. My director uses this analogy that I love, and she says that a boat sitting still is really hard to move in any direction. You have to start up the engines and you have to get things running and you've got to get the crew. But a ship that's already moving in a direction is so much easier to steer in different directions. Those gears and things are already working. And so we always challenge students that as well, is just run after the things before you, keep pursuing them, and then see where the Lord leads. Walk in obedience in that, but see where that goes. And so serving globally is one that we'd say, yeah, if you're a little bit interested, why not explore it? I think people always ask why go, and we like to flip it on its head and say, why not go? Like, what would be stopping you? And so I like that you kind of have encouraged and challenged students in that, just to ask themselves, why would I not consider something like this next? So I love that. It looks like I got a few questions from some people joining us. So the first question actually is for Aaron and Scott. So it says, it's no secret that most engineer grads can make a lot of money right out of college. As an engineering grad, I guess there's lots of options in that field. And so what would you say to someone that's considering something like a GoCore position or serving globally, where maybe the pay is less? And if you go through GoCore, you are support based, so that does look very different. So what would you say to that? Why still consider this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Definitely something I've thought about. Over the last 3 years, I've worked like 5 different engineering jobs here in the US, and I've really enjoyed them. And a lot of the people that I've worked with and the salaries have also been very nice as well. But ultimately, like for me, it was before that I wanted to do this, like work internationally. So again, my experience growing up in East Africa for 18 years is part of my drive and desire to work in other countries. And part of that comes from just in everyday life, I would see extreme poverty around me a lot of the time, and realizing that most of the world lives in this extreme poverty. For me, it's something that's very I don't know, it's like a burden that's on me to fight that, the physical as well as the spiritual needs. And as engineers, you can solve problems, you can create solutions and develop people to work through some of that. One of the things that has made me want to go this support raising route, even though it's super challenging, and not go with a well-paying job, is just looking at all of the opportunities again that I've been given in my life, and how am I going to spend my time and my life. Opportunities that I have, like growing up in East Africa, having that experience, being able to see how a lot of the world lives, but then also like having parents who have always had enough money, who have raised me well, and then opportunities like getting a college education. There's so few people who are able to do that each year. And so I really, really feel that those opportunities have been given to me so that I can give back to others. So I want to help others receive those opportunities. Just seeing so many people who don't have, yeah, as I've worked in various industries in the US, I have enjoyed it. But the pull on my heart, the tug is like, this is not what I want to do long term. I just so agree with Matt in talking about being in other countries and getting experience there, which I don't have work experience yet in other countries, but being able to live cross-culturally is an extremely rich and powerful experience. And I'm like, if it's just for 2 years, even for someone, I highly suggest it. Yeah, for so many reasons.
I think for me, the first thing, honestly, is just obedience to Jesus as a Christian. The Great Commission is clear: go and make disciples of all nations. To me, that as a Christian, he's commanded all of us to do that. Obviously, you could do that here, you could do that overseas. But, why not go down the path, see if he opens the doors? There are lots of things that can come up. He can close the doors to going overseas. But why not try that hardest path and see if that's something God's calling you to? And if he closes the doors, he's made it clear: stay here, get a job, do commercial engineering, do something other than serving overseas. But let him answer that question. Let him close the door instead of taking it upon yourself to close or open the doors. So I think that's a big one for me. I think the other thing is that, we've got a pretty good handle on what life looks like if you decide to go into commercial engineering here. You know what the pay is, what the job looks like day to day. The mystery box, what you don't know is the opportunities and what God can do in your life through you if you choose to go overseas. I was really wrestling with this, when I was actually at Go Week many years ago, and I was like, man, like I don't want to be here. Like I just want to go get a job, stay in my hometown and do commercial engineering. And I was sitting on the beach looking out at the ocean, just praying about it, wrestling with it. And I had read a passage in scripture, and it was, I forget the reference now, but basically God was saying to one of the prophets, the things I'm going to do, you wouldn't believe it even if I showed it to you. It's so incredible. And to me, like that was that moment that God just flipped a switch and turned my heart, and he said, you don't even know the incredible things that you're going to get to do, experience, that I'm going to show you by going down this path. You know what it looks like if you stay here. You know that path in front of you if you choose to go down that. The path less taken is the one that's going to be satisfying, the one that's worth it.
Abby, could I just add to that on
Yeah.
that closed door part? I think that Scott mentioned is so interesting and so valuable to consider because, a little bit of my story. I had an engineering company overseas in Indonesia doing rural electrification for years, and eventually that door was closed. It's a longer story there. And I pivoted out of engineering and am now in education. I'm still working overseas, but I think that idea of calling and exactly what Scott and Aaron are talking about in terms of, using your skill set to follow God professionally can take a variety of paths. And sometimes when one door is closed, another door is open. And as engineers, I just want to encourage people who are listening to this, your skill set to do, actual design engineering, is there, but engineers can do a whole variety and are often asked and excellent at doing a whole variety of tasks in a variety of industries. And so I want to encourage new engineers out there that even if the exact engineering role that you thought that you were bound for, you're not in, or it's closing, there are so many ways, and especially internationally, to be used and to use your skill set.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I am a sucker for a good analogy, and so often share those with candidates I'm working with. And like I said earlier, I am not an engineer, could never ever enter into that world. But when I was approaching my senior year, I got married, and my husband and I were hoping to end up overseas, and that was just totally where we were running. There was no other option. To us, all the other doors were closed. International was the only door open, and it was so weird our senior year, looking at graduating, to see the Lord clearly shut some doors and clearly opened others. And we walked through that, and we saw that. And yeah, really interesting to see peace come as we walk in obedience to where the Lord is leading. And there's a quote that I sometimes share with my students, and it's super challenging. And it's this idea that, like, often as believers, we think that we have to have a special calling to serve internationally in whatever capacity, but actually we should have the opposite. We should be striving to not be called to serve overseas internationally and making disciples in order to not go. And so this idea that, like, man, we should all be, kind of like you were saying, Scott, we should all be looking to go down that harder path where those open doors lead, going, making disciples, being a part of the Great Commission. And often we just find ourselves stuck in the opposite viewpoint. And I like how both, actually all three of you guys kind of tagged into that and piggybacked off of that thought. I think it's a really challenging and convicting thought to kind of wrestle and sit with. And I think that hopefully people will hear this from us today, that wrestling is good. That wrestling is healthy. In the wrestling, I think, is where we find full surrender. And so if you're in that place where you're wrestling with what to do after graduation, you have the options before you, keep leaning, keep pushing into that wrestling. I think that in that place is where we kind of find that sweet spot, like you said, Scott, where the Lord says, here I am, and I have bigger plans than you can even imagine. Just trust me. And so I love that all three of you kind of piggybacked off of that. It looks like I've got one more question. So anybody feel free to answer. All three of y'all can tag into this one, but it looks like we had someone ask, other than an engineering degree, what are some characteristics that you would see in people and candidates that would maybe make them a good fit for international engineering? So we got the degree. What other skills or things about somebody would you say, yeah, international engineering, that's something you should think about?
I'd be happy to start this one off. I think there's humility and flexibility are the two characteristics that really jump out at me. Humility in terms of engineering is a really hard major, a really hard field. And once you make it through that, there can be a hubris of, I know this, passed the FEI, whatever. But it really is any undergraduate degree, at that point you're starting with a really strong foundation, but it's foundational, and there's mentoring, there's a whole journey ahead to really develop that skill set and be able to be really effective. Start with humility. I think flexibility is the other key piece in that as a new engineer grad moves into global work internationally, you're coming having spent probably your life swimming in one pool, one type of water, having one, cultural experience. A book that I use in one of my classes is When Helping Hurts. And the author looks at this idea of monochronic versus polychronic views of time, time being finite versus infinite, values of efficiency. And if you're coming from North America, you have a really specific view of those things. And as soon as you get out into other parts of the world, you realize that values and ways of looking at things and ways of approaching projects, ways of making decisions are so different. And so it's so important to come with flexibility to learn from that, to be changed and to then enter into it and bring, your engineering skill set to adapt and grow in that space.
Yeah, and I would just, I think echo Matt's point. I think for me, the biggest thing is like you mentioned, just flexibility. In my story, I had a destination, a plan for what I was doing overseas with the org that I went with, But by the end of my time overseas, I'd served in 4 different locations around the world, different continents, had visa issues. My time overseas ended because of terrorist threats against our team and we had to get evacuated. So, you just have to hold it open-handedly. You can't get locked into this picture and this idea of this is exactly what I'm going to be doing overseas. But you just have to live day by day and have the flexibility to say, God, whatever you have for me today, that's what I'm all in for.
I like hearing from both of you because you've done this. And for me, it's just, I've only been out of school for 2.5 years now. But even in that, I'm in the same boat. There's some visa stuff that happens that's extremely common no matter what you're trying to do overseas. And paths change, they shift. I mean, working like 5 different jobs in the last 3 years has been crazy. But yeah, I think that being flexible within that, and then also just having open hands and saying, whatever way you lead me, God, whatever you want to do, that's where I'm going to go. And then pressing into that, because you really have to press in and ask questions and ask other people and get connections and figure out where that is and what that's going to look like.
That I couldn't have answered that better. Thank you guys so much. You have been just a wealth of knowledge, and I believe that your words today and just the stories you've shared and the advice you've been given will be really helpful to future candidates and goers that are looking at engineering and looking at how to use that cross-culturally and how to kind of connect all the dots together. As we kind of wrap up our time, I did want to just ask you guys broadly and briefly, is there anything else you would share? That's the questions we got from people, and that kind of sums up some of the things that I was kind of coming to this event with questions about. But as we kind of wrap up today, and it's okay if not, I just want to leave some space if there's anything else that you would share.
I just want to encourage engineering students, people with a technical background. I think we've hit on this, but I think it's so important to emphasize God's created you with these passions, with these skill sets for a reason, and you can absolutely use those in service capacities, especially internationally. That was not clear to me when I was 22 years old, and I want it to be just abundantly clear that you don't need to be, you can be, and there is a huge need for Bible translators and pastors, but engineers are needed overseas. So press into that.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just say that, I think generally as engineers, we tend to be somewhat conservative. We tend to want to have plans and have a clear path. And, really what I would say is just go all in. Think of the biggest, most incredible, ambitious thing that God could use you to do for his kingdom, and just run straight into that and let him direct you from there.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. For me, in starting out, I look at people like Matt and like Scott, and I'm like, in 10, 20 years, where do I want to be? What experiences do I want to have had? And it's like, you only have one life. It's a little cliche, but like you really do only have one life, and it's not long. So what are you going to do with it? And for me, it's like, that's what I want to be doing. I want to be working internationally. It's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging in so many ways, but it's going to be so good. And I know that God will bless that.
I don't often get emotional on these, but I'm feeling a little emotional about that today. That's really, 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 I think, just the heart at what some of our goers are walking through too, is like, how do I be used? Does the Lord actually want to use me? And this thing that I've worked towards, I just think you guys have addressed so many barriers that 20-something-year-olds face as they are trying to pursue, if serving globally is what the Lord is leading them to next. And so thank you guys again, panelists Matt, Scott, Aaron, for just sharing with us today, for being open and flexible and available for our virtual event today. As we kind of wind down the event, I mentioned earlier that I would just highlight 2 of our engineering placements for this year. This list does change every year. So if you're a senior and looking at going this year, or maybe you're in your 20s and now you're looking at serving globally, these 2 positions would be available for you this year. I'll preface that by saying we do have an application deadline coming up. So our application deadline is March 1st, so about 5 weeks away. So if you have questions after today, if you're interested, my email is abby@gocor.org. Feel free to shoot me an email. If you want to hear more from Matt or Aaron or Scott, I can connect you with them. I know they would love to continue the conversation and be helpful in as you piece things together. So coming back to those 2 placements though, the first one, it's titled Engineering Technical Administrator for Medical Ship. And this is in Papua New Guinea. You're actually headquartered out of Hawaii, so not a bad place to live most of the year. And then you hop on a cruise ship that's been restructured into a medical ship. And so the goal of this ship is to go from island to island in Papua New Guinea, basically hitting very isolated islands that have little or no access to healthcare as well as the gospel. And so your job as this engineer is to make sure that this boat runs, is to make sure that it can get from place to place. So again, coming back to everything we've talked about, that role is so needed in order for doctors and nurses and the gospel. We need people with skills that can look at that and really work on the boat. So that's the first one, super, super interesting. The other one we have available this year is a food industry engineer in Indonesia. With this one, what's really unique is that you get to pursue a master's as you figure out what engineering would look like on the field in this position. The team leaders here are incredible and have been doing this work for years and years and years. And they are a part of basically a movement that is taking dried fruit from Indonesia, started with mangoes, and now they're kind of exploring different fruits and creating dried fruit to provide sustainable jobs for locals and then getting to sell those products. So I've actually tried their dried mango. It is delicious, super, super yummy. And so you get to be a part of again, this holistic idea of bringing tangible resources and skills to a place like Indonesia, where before they were crushing rocks and providing that as food for income, but now they're going to take this abundance that they have of fruit, and because engineers were able to use their skills, use the way that their minds work to come in and create a processing plant, man, now there is so much more going on there. And so that's the other one. You'd be working in the food industry a little bit, dried fruit processing. So both very unique, very different, but really only an engineer could do these. Some of our placements, you don't have to have necessarily those hands-on skills in order to apply for that work. But for these 2 positions, they are looking for engineers. They're looking for someone that studied that and knows a little bit about the field and the profession. All the positions are entry level, so you don't have to have any experience yet in that field. So yeah, again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Look at our website, gocor.org, and all of that information is on there. But thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you guys for tuning in.